Welcome back to Galactic Dream Station. Tonight we journey to a small Kentucky town where the summer of 1955 brought visitors no one expected. Before we begin, if these encounters from forgotten corners of America keep you curious, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next story. This is part of our Unknown series, where we explore mysteries without easy answers, from the backwoods to the city lights. Part 1. The Summer of Terror. On the evening of August 21, 1955, the Sutton family gathered for what should have been an ordinary Sunday dinner at their farmhouse near the tiny community of Kelly, Kentucky. The home sat 8 miles north of Hopkinsville, surrounded by tobacco fields and dense woodland that stretched toward the horizon. It was the kind of place where neighbors were few, nights were dark, and the nearest streetlight was miles away. Elmer Sutton, known as Lucky to his friends, had invited his family to spend the weekend. His wife Vera was there, along with his brother John Charlie Sutton and John Charlie's wife Aline. Glennie Langford, Lucky's mother, had come with her children Lunny, Charlton, and Mary. Billy Ray Taylor, a friend visiting from Pennsylvania, brought his wife June. In total, 11 people filled the modest farmhouse that evening, ranging in age from 7-year-old Charlton to 50-year-old Glennie. The house itself was typical of rural Kentucky, a simple frame structure with few amenities. No telephone connected them to the outside world, and no indoor plumbing served the family's needs. Water came from a well in the backyard. Light came from kerosene lamps and a few electric bulbs powered by the rural line that had only recently reached this remote corner of Christian County. The isolation was complete, the kind that city dwellers rarely experience and country people take for granted. As evening settled over the fields, the family finished their meal and began the slow transition toward night. The men stepped onto the back porch to smoke and talk. The women cleared dishes and tended to the children. Outside, crickets filled the summer air with their familiar chorus, and fireflies began their nightly dance above the tobacco rows. It was peaceful, routine, unremarkable in every way. Billy Ray Taylor was the first to see something wrong. Around 7 o'clock, he walked to the well behind the house to draw water for washing. The sky was still bright in the west, though shadows were lengthening across the yard. As he worked the pump handle, a streak of light caught his attention. High overhead, something brilliant was moving across the evening sky, too bright to be a star, too steady to be a meteor. Taylor watched as the object descended toward a wooded gully about a quarter-mile from the house. It appeared to land, or at least disappear behind the tree line, in that direction. The light faded, leaving only the normal twilight settling over the countryside. Taylor stood by the well for a moment, pump handle still in his hand, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Then he hurried back to the house. Inside, Taylor described the light to the others. He spoke of something silver or metallic that had come down in the woods, glowing as it moved. The family listened with the polite attention reserved for unusual stories, but no one seemed particularly concerned. Shooting stars were not uncommon in rural Kentucky, and aircraft from nearby military bases occasionally passed overhead. Whatever Taylor had seen, it was probably explainable and certainly not threatening. The conversation moved on to other topics. Children were called in from their play. Lamps were lit as darkness crept across the fields. The normal rhythm of a Sunday evening continued, unhurried and familiar. No one suggested investigating the light in the woods. No one felt the need to walk out and look toward the gully, where Taylor claimed something had come down. The incident seemed closed, filed away as one of those small mysteries that country life occasionally provides. But the light in the woods was only the beginning. What happened next would transform an ordinary evening into one of the most documented encounters in American history, leaving 11 witnesses with memories that would never fade and questions that would never find satisfactory answers. Part 2. The visitors arrived. An hour passed. The sun disappeared behind the western hills, and full darkness settled over the Sutton farm. Inside the house, the family continued their evening routines. Children played quietly in the front room, while adults talked and prepared for bed. The kerosene lamps cast warm circles of light that pushed back the Kentucky night, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that rural families knew well. It was Lucky Sutton's dog that first sensed trouble. The animal had been resting on the back porch, content and quiet through the evening. but around 8 o'clock, it began to whine and pace. The whining grew more intense, becoming a low, anxious sound that carried through the screen door into the kitchen. Then, without warning, the dog bolted from the porch and disappeared under the house, crawling into the narrow space between the floor joists and the ground. Lucky stepped outside to see what had disturbed the animal. The night was warm and still, with no wind to rustle the tobacco leaves. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, and the familiar sounds of crickets and tree frogs filled the air. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the dog remained hidden beneath the house, whimpering softly in the darkness. As Lucky stood on the porch, listening and looking, Billy Ray Taylor joined him. Both men peered into the night, trying to spot whatever had frightened the dog. The yard was empty, the fields beyond quiet and undisturbed. They were about to return inside when Taylor pointed toward the back of the property. Something was moving at the edge of the woods, perhaps 60 yards from the house. At first, it appeared to be a man walking slowly across the open ground between the tree line and the tobacco field. But as the figure drew closer, details became visible that made no sense. The shape was too small to be a full-grown person, perhaps 3.5 feet tall, yet it moved upright on 2 legs. Its proportions were wrong, with an oversized head and arms that seemed to reach nearly to the ground. The figure continued its approach, moving directly toward the house with a strange, gliding gait that seemed to cover ground without the normal rhythm of walking. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out features, but both men could see that its skin or covering appeared to glow with a faint, silvery light. The head was large and round, sitting on narrow shoulders, and the arms swayed as it moved, but never seemed to bend at the elbows. Taylor called softly to Lucky, asking if he could see the approaching figure. Lucky nodded, his eyes fixed on the strange visitor. Neither man spoke above a whisper, as if afraid to draw attention to themselves. The figure continued forward, now close enough that they could see it clearly despite the darkness. It was like nothing either had ever encountered. When the creature reached the edge of the yard, perhaps 30 feet from the back porch, it stopped. For a long moment, it stood motionless, as if studying the house and the 2 men watching from the doorway. Its head turned slightly, revealing what appeared to be large, dark eyes that reflected the faint light from the windows. There was no visible mouth or nose, just the smooth, pale surface of a face dominated by those enormous eyes. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of the dog whimpering beneath the house. Then, without warning, the creature raised its arms above its head. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if it were reaching toward the sky or perhaps signaling to something unseen. The arms remained extended for several seconds, then lowered again to its sides. Lucky had seen enough. He stepped back into the house and returned with his 20-gauge shotgun, a weapon he kept loaded for dealing with foxes and other predators that threatened the chickens. Taylor followed him back outside, carrying a .22 caliber rifle. Both men were experienced hunters, comfortable with firearms and unafraid of whatever might be lurking in their backyard. The creature had not moved. It stood in the same spot, arms at its sides, apparently unaware or unconcerned about the weapons now pointed in its direction. Lucky raised his shotgun, took careful aim, and fired. The blast echoed across the fields, a sharp crack that sent night birds fleeing from the nearby trees. At that range, the shot should have knocked down anything living. Instead, the creature flipped backward, as if the pellets had struck something metallic. It tumbled once and came to rest on its back, then immediately rolled over and scrambled to its feet. Without pausing, it turned and ran toward the woods, moving with the same gliding gait, but now at incredible speed. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the tree line, leaving the 2 men staring after it in amazement. Taylor and Lucky exchanged glances, neither quite believing what they had just witnessed. A shotgun blast at 30 feet should have been fatal to any animal, yet the creature had reacted as if hit by nothing more than a strong push. It had shown no sign of injury, no blood, no cry of pain. It had simply gotten up and run away, moving faster than seemed possible for something so small. The 2 men remained on the porch, weapons ready, scanning the edge of the woods for any sign of movement. The night had returned to its normal quiet, with crickets resuming their chorus and the dog gradually emerging from beneath the house. But both men knew that something extraordinary had just occurred, something that would require explanation to the rest of the family. Inside the house, the sound of the gunshot had brought everyone to their feet. Glennie Langford demanded to know what was happening, while the children pressed against the windows, trying to see into the backyard. Lucky and Taylor returned to the house and described their encounter. speaking in low voices but unable to hide their excitement and confusion. The family gathered in the kitchen, voices overlapping as questions were asked and theories proposed. Some suggested it might have been a monkey escaped from a circus, though no circus was known to be in the area. Others wondered if it could have been a small person, perhaps a child playing an elaborate prank. But the description of the glowing skin and the reaction to the shotgun blast made such explanations seem inadequate. As the discussion continued, a new sound interrupted the conversation. From outside came a faint scratching noise, as if something were climbing the side of the house. The talking stopped immediately, and everyone listened. The scratching continued, moving slowly from the back of the house toward the front, accompanied by what sounded like claws or fingernails dragging across the wooden siding. Lucky grabbed his shotgun and moved toward the front door, with Taylor close behind carrying the rifle. The rest of the family remained in the kitchen, huddled together and speaking in whispers. The scratching sound paused directly above the front porch, suggesting that whatever was making it had reached the roof. Slowly, Lucky opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. He looked up toward the roof line, where the faint glow of a kerosene lamp from inside the house cast weak light on the wooden shingles. There, peering down at him from the edge of the roof, was another creature identical to the one they had encountered in the backyard. This one was closer, perhaps 12 feet away, and clearly visible in the lamplight. Its skin had the same silvery glow, and its oversized head was dominated by the same large, dark eyes. It crouched on the roof edge like a cat, perfectly balanced despite the steep angle, and stared down at Lucky with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lucky raised his shotgun and fired directly at the creature's head. Again, the blast should have been devastating at such close range. Instead, the creature simply flipped backward off the roof, landing somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch, with a metallic sound like a tin can hitting the ground. Taylor rushed to Lucky's side, and both men peered into the night, trying to see where the creature had fallen. But before they could spot it, more sounds came from different directions. Scratching from the back of the house, footsteps in the side yard, and what sounded like multiple creatures moving through the darkness around the property. The realization hit both men simultaneously. They were not dealing with a single intruder, but with several. The creatures were surrounding the house, approaching from multiple directions, and showing no fear of the weapons that had already been used against them twice. Whatever these things were, they had not been deterred by gunfire, and they were not going away. Lucky and Taylor retreated into the house and quickly barricaded the door. The siege of the Sutton farmhouse had begun. Part 3. Under siege. Inside the farmhouse, panic began to take hold. The sound of multiple creatures moving around the property was now unmistakable. Footsteps circled the house. Scratching sounds came from different walls, and occasionally a face would appear at one of the windows, peering in with those large, dark eyes before disappearing again. Glennie Langford gathered the children in the center of the front room, away from the windows. The younger ones cried softly, while the older children pressed close to their mother, eyes wide with fear. Vera Sutton and Aline Sutton helped keep the children calm, speaking in soothing whispers while their husbands maintained watch at the doors and windows. Lucky positioned himself at the front of the house, while Taylor took the back. Both men kept their weapons ready, moving from window to window as sounds indicated the creatures were changing position. The house had several windows on each side, making it impossible to watch every possible point of entry simultaneously. The feeling of being outnumbered and surrounded was overwhelming. The creatures seemed to understand that the humans were armed and dangerous, but they showed no inclination to retreat. Instead, they appeared to be studying the house and its occupants, approaching close enough to peer through windows before withdrawing into the darkness. Their movements suggested intelligence and coordination, as if they were working together to observe and perhaps test the defenses of the building. Around 9:30, one of the creatures appeared at the kitchen window. June Taylor, who was helping to calm the children, was the first to see it. She screamed and pointed, bringing both Lucky and Billy Ray running. The creature's face was pressed against the glass, its large eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside. It remained there for several seconds, apparently unafraid, studying the humans who were staring back at it. Lucky raised his shotgun and fired through the window. The glass shattered, and the creature flipped backward into the darkness. But within minutes, scratching sounds from the roof indicated that either the same creature or another one had climbed up the side of the house, and, was moving across the shingles directly overhead. The family could hear footsteps above them, slow and deliberate, as if the creature were exploring the roof and testing its stability. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as the footsteps moved from one end of the house to the other. Then came the sound of something being dragged across the wooden shingles, followed by silence. Taylor suggested they might be trying to find a way into the attic, perhaps through a gap in the roof or around the chimney. The thought of the creatures getting inside the house terrified everyone, particularly the women and children, who were already struggling to maintain their composure. Lucky decided they needed to take more aggressive action. He and Taylor stepped onto the back porch, weapons ready, and began firing at anything that moved in the darkness. They could see faint shapes darting between the trees at the edge of the property, always staying just beyond the range of clear identification, but close enough to suggest they were still being watched. The men fired repeatedly, aiming at shadows and movement, but never seemed to hit anything solid. What disturbed them most was the creature's reaction to being shot. Each time a blast struck one directly, it would flip backward or tumble, as if hit by a powerful force, but then immediately recover and either run away or climb to a new position. There was never any sign of injury, no blood, no cries of pain. The creatures seemed immune to damage, or at least able to absorb the impact of shotgun pellets and rifle bullets without lasting effect. During one exchange of gunfire, Taylor claimed he saw one of the creatures floating or gliding rather than running. It appeared to move across the backyard without its feet touching the ground, arms extended for balance, drifting like a balloon in a gentle breeze. The sight was so unusual that Taylor called Lucky's attention to it, and both men watched as the figure glided toward the woods and disappeared among the trees. By 10 o'clock, the siege had been ongoing for nearly 2 hours. The creatures continued to circle the house, appearing at windows, climbing on the roof, and making their presence known through sounds and brief glimpses. The family inside was exhausted from the constant tension, and the men were running low on ammunition. Lucky had fired his shotgun more than a dozen times, while Taylor had emptied 2 boxes of .22 caliber shells. Both weapons were designed for hunting small game, not for sustained combat, and their supply of ammunition was not unlimited. The realization that they might run out of shells while the creatures remained active was deeply troubling. The children were no longer crying, but they remained huddled together in the center of the room, too frightened to move or speak above whispers. Glennie Langford tried to maintain calm by telling them stories and singing softly, but her voice shook with fear, and her eyes constantly moved to the windows and doors. Around 10:30, the activity outside seemed to intensify. More scratching sounds came from multiple walls simultaneously, suggesting that several creatures were climbing on the house at the same time. Footsteps on the roof became more frequent and seemed to be coming from different directions, as if multiple creatures were exploring the upper surfaces of the building. Then came a new sound that chilled everyone in the house. From outside, barely audible above the scratching and footsteps, came what sounded like voices. Not human voices, but a kind of chittering or chattering, like birds or insects communicating with each other. The sounds were rhythmic and seemed to carry meaning, as if the creatures were talking among themselves in their own language. Lucky pressed his ear to the front door, trying to make out the source and nature of the sounds. The chittering seemed to be coming from multiple directions, sometimes from the backyard, sometimes from the side of the house, sometimes from the roof. It was as if the creatures were coordinating their activities, sharing information or making plans. The realization that these things might be intelligent enough to communicate with each other was more frightening than anything else that had happened. Wild animals might attack a house, but they would not work together in an organized fashion. These creatures were displaying behavior that suggested not just intelligence, but strategy. As the chittering continued, Taylor noticed that the creatures seemed to be timing their appearances at different windows. When one showed itself at the kitchen window, another would appear at the front room window seconds later, as if they were deliberately trying to divide the attention of the defenders. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental. By 11 o'clock, The family was near exhaustion. The constant vigilance required to watch multiple windows and doors was wearing them down, and the children were becoming increasingly difficult to comfort. Several times, Lucky had considered making a run for the car parked in the front yard, but the thought of exposing the women and children to whatever was waiting outside was too risky. The creatures showed no sign of losing interest or growing tired. If anything, their activity seemed to be increasing as the night wore on. More faces appeared at windows, more sounds came from the roof, and the chittering grew more frequent and complex. It was as if they were building up to something, preparing for a more direct confrontation. Around 11:30, one of the creatures appeared at the side window closest to where the children were huddled. It pressed its face against the glass and remained there for nearly a full minute, staring directly at the frightened family. The sight of those large, dark eyes examining the children was too much for Glennie Langford, who began to sob quietly. Lucky could stand no more. He raised his shotgun and fired through the window, shattering the glass and sending the creature tumbling backward into the darkness. But this time, instead of running away, the creature quickly recovered and returned to the window, peering through the broken glass with what seemed like increased curiosity. The message was clear. The creatures were not going to be driven away by gunfire. They were not afraid of the humans or their weapons, and they were not going to leave the family alone. Whatever they wanted, whatever had brought them to the Sutton farmhouse that night, they were prepared to stay until they got it. As midnight approached, Lucky made a decision that would change everything. They could not remain in the house indefinitely, and the creatures showed no sign of departing. It was time to seek help, even if it meant leaving the safety of the building and venturing into the darkness, where the creatures waited. The family would have to make a run for the car and drive to Hopkinsville, where they could alert the authorities and find safety in numbers. But first, they would have to get past whatever was lurking in the yard between the house and their escape route. Part 4. The escape to Hopkinsville. The decision to leave the house did not come easily. For more than 3 hours, the Sutton family had remained barricaded inside while the creatures maintained their siege. The building had provided protection, but it had also become a trap. With ammunition running low and the creatures showing no sign of departing, Lucky realized that staying might be more dangerous than leaving. The plan was simple but terrifying. All 11 family members would move together from the house to Lucky's car, which sat in the front yard about 30 feet from the porch. The men would provide cover with their remaining ammunition while the women and children ran for the vehicle. Once everyone was inside, they would drive directly to Hopkinsville and seek help from the police. The greatest risk was the moment of exposure between the house and the car. In the darkness, they would be vulnerable to attack from creatures that had already demonstrated their ability to move quickly and apparently without fear of weapons. But remaining in the house was no longer an option. The siege could continue all night, and there was no guarantee that the creatures would not find a way inside. Lucky checked his shotgun one final time. He had perhaps 4 shells remaining. Taylor counted his rifle ammunition and found he had fewer than 10 rounds left. Both weapons would have to be used carefully, saved for the moment when protection was most needed. There would be no opportunity for warning shots or suppressing fire. Glennie Langford gathered the children around her, speaking in whispers about the need to stay together and move quickly. The youngest, 7-year-old Charlton, was lifted into the arms of his older brother Lunny. The women prepared to carry or guide the other children, ensuring that no one would be left behind in the confusion of escape. At 12:15 in the morning of August 22nd, Lucky slowly opened the front door. The porch was empty, but sounds from around the house indicated the creatures were still present. Scratching came from the roof, and footsteps could be heard in the side yard. The chittering voices had quieted, but they had not disappeared entirely. Lucky stepped onto the porch first, shotgun ready, scanning the yard for movement. The car sat in the pale starlight, its dark shape outlined against the lighter gravel of the driveway. The distance seemed much greater than 30 feet. Between the house and the vehicle lay open ground, where the family would be exposed and vulnerable. Taylor joined Lucky on the porch, and both men peered into the darkness surrounding the car. Nothing moved, but they knew that meant little. The creatures had proven adept at remaining hidden until they chose to reveal themselves. The yard could be empty, or it could be full of watchers waiting in the shadows. Behind them, the family prepared for the dash to safety. Glennie held Charlton while Vera and Aline positioned themselves to help the other children. June Taylor stayed close to her husband, ready to run when the signal was given. Everyone understood that once they left the house, there could be no turning back. Lucky gave the word, and the family moved as one. They burst through the door and ran across the yard, feet pounding on the gravel, children crying, women calling out encouragement and warnings. Lucky and Taylor flanked the group, weapons ready, eyes searching the darkness for any sign of pursuit. Halfway to the car, a creature appeared at the edge of the yard. It stood motionless, watching the fleeing family, but making no move to intercept them. Lucky raised his shotgun but held his fire, unwilling to waste ammunition unless the creature posed an immediate threat. The thing simply stood and observed, as if curious about this sudden burst of activity. The family reached the car without incident. Doors were yanked open, and everyone piled inside. Children pushed into laps, adults crowding together on the seats. Lucky started the engine while Taylor kept watch through the rear window. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on gravel, and began the 8-mile journey to Hopkinsville. As they pulled away from the house, Taylor reported seeing several creatures emerge from the woods and gather in the yard they had just abandoned. The things stood in a group, apparently watching the departing vehicle, but made no attempt to follow. Their behavior suggested they were connected to the property rather than to the family itself, as if the house and its immediate surroundings were their primary area of interest. The drive to Hopkinsville took 20 minutes along dark country roads. No one spoke during the journey except to comfort the children or point out shadows that might or might not be significant. Everyone remained alert, watching for any sign that they were being followed. But the creatures did not appear to have pursued them beyond the boundaries of the farm. Hopkinsville in 1955 was a small city of about 7,000 people, the county seat of Christian County, and a regional center for tobacco farming and commerce. At 12:30 in the morning, the downtown area was quiet and largely deserted, with only a few businesses still showing lights. The police station occupied a modest building on Main Street, staffed by a small force of local officers who were accustomed to dealing with minor crimes and occasional disturbances. Lucky parked in front of the police station and led his family inside. The desk sergeant on duty, Russell Greenwell, looked up in surprise as 11 people crowded into the small lobby, several of them children who were clearly upset and frightened. The adults appeared shaken and exhausted, and both Lucky and Taylor still carried their weapons. Sergeant Greenwell asked what had happened, and Lucky began to describe the events at the farmhouse. He spoke carefully, trying to present the facts without sounding hysterical or unbelievable, but the story was so unusual that Greenwell had difficulty accepting it at face value. Creatures with glowing skin, immunity to gunfire, and the ability to climb walls and roofs sounded more like something from a science fiction movie than a real police report. Other officers were called in to hear the account. Chief Russell Greenwell, the sergeant's brother, arrived to interview the family personally. Detective Lieutenant Charles Batts also responded, along with several patrolmen who were curious about the unusual late-night visitors. The police station, normally quiet at that hour, became busy with activity as word spread that something extraordinary had occurred in the county. The family members were interviewed separately to prevent them from influencing each other's accounts. Each person was asked to describe what they had seen and heard, and their statements were carefully recorded. Despite being questioned individually, their stories remained consistent in all major details. All agreed on the creature's appearance, behavior, and apparent immunity to weapons fire. What impressed the officers most was the obvious sincerity of the witnesses. These were not people seeking attention or publicity. They were frightened, exhausted, and reluctant to discuss details that made them sound foolish or unbelievable. The children's reactions in particular suggested genuine terror rather than participation in an elaborate hoax. Chief Greenwell decided that the situation warranted investigation. Whether or not the family had actually encountered visitors from another world, something had clearly frightened them badly enough to flee their home in the middle of the night. If there were intruders on the property, armed or otherwise, the police had a responsibility to respond. A convoy of police vehicles was organized to return to the Sutton farm. Chief Greenwell led the group, accompanied by Detective Batts, Sergeant Greenwell, and several patrolmen. The family was asked to remain at the police station while the officers investigated, both for their own safety and to prevent contamination of any evidence that might be found. As the police cars pulled away from the station and headed into the countryside, word of the incident began to spread through Hopkinsville. Radio communications between the station and the patrol cars were monitored by local residents who owned police scanners, and within hours the story would reach reporters and curiosity seekers from across the region. The Kelly incident, as it would come to be known, was about to expand beyond a single family's terrifying night. It would become a public event, drawing attention from investigators, skeptics, and believers who would debate its significance for decades to come. But first, the police would have to determine what, if anything, remained at the scene of the encounter. Part 5. The police investigation. The convoy of police vehicles arrived at the Sutton farm shortly before 1:30 in the morning. Chief Russell Greenwell led 4 officers and Detective Lieutenant Charles Batts in a careful approach to the property. Their headlights swept across the yard and illuminated the modest farmhouse, which appeared quiet and undisturbed in the darkness. The officers parked near the front porch and emerged from their vehicles with flashlights and weapons drawn. Standard procedure required them to treat the call as a possible break-in or assault, regardless of how unusual the family's description of the intruders might have been. If armed individuals were on the property, the police needed to be prepared for confrontation. Chief Greenwell called out, identifying himself and demanding that anyone present show themselves. His voice carried across the quiet countryside, but no response came from the house or the surrounding woods. The only sounds were the normal night noises of crickets and tree frogs, along with the idling engines of the patrol cars. The officers spread out to examine the property systematically. Detective Batts and 2 patrolmen circled the house, looking for signs of forced entry or damage. Other officers checked the outbuildings and the edge of the woods, where the family claimed the creatures had first appeared. Their flashlights probed every shadow and examined every surface for evidence of the reported encounter. The investigation immediately revealed signs that supported the family's account. The kitchen window that Lucky had shot through was indeed shattered, with glass scattered on the ground outside. Shotgun pellets were embedded in the wooden siding near several windows, confirming that multiple shots had been fired from inside the house toward the exterior walls. More significant were the marks found on the screens and siding. Several window screens showed tears that appeared to have been made by claws or sharp objects scraping from outside. The metal mesh was pulled and twisted in patterns consistent with something trying to gain entry or at least examine the interior of the house. On the roof, officers found scratches in the wooden shingles and evidence that something heavy had moved across the surface. The marks were concentrated near the edges of the roof, particularly above the windows, suggesting that whatever had made them was interested in observing the interior of the house. The scratches were too deep and too numerous to have been made by cats or other common animals. Detective Batts discovered what appeared to be footprints in the soft earth near the back porch. The impressions were small, roughly the size of a child's foot, but with unusual proportions. The prints showed 3 distinct toes or claws, with what appeared to be webbing between them. No heel mark was visible, suggesting that whatever had made the tracks walked on the balls of its feet or had an entirely different foot structure than humans. The prints formed a trail that led from the woods toward the house, then circled the building before disappearing on the harder ground of the front yard. There were at least a dozen clear impressions, indicating that multiple individuals had approached the house or that the same individual had made several trips around the property. Inside the house, the officers found additional evidence of the siege. Spent shotgun shells and rifle cartridges littered the floors near the windows. The family had clearly fired a substantial number of rounds during the encounter, far more than would be expected in a typical hunting accident or warning shots to scare away prowlers. The furniture had been moved away from the windows, and blankets had been hung over some of the openings in an apparent attempt to block the view from outside. The arrangement suggested that the family had been trying to hide from observation while maintaining defensive positions. Children's toys were scattered in the center of the main room, indicating that the younger family members had been kept away from the windows during the incident. What the officers did not find was equally significant. There was no blood anywhere on the property, despite the family's claims that they had shot the creatures multiple times at close range. No bodies were discovered, nor any fragments of clothing or other material that might have been left behind by human intruders. The creatures, whatever they were, had left no biological evidence of their presence. The absence of conventional evidence did not necessarily invalidate the family's account. The physical signs of the encounter were clear and consistent with their description of events. Something had approached the house, climbed on the walls and roof, and attracted enough gunfire to leave dozens of spent shells inside the building. The question was not whether something had occurred, but what exactly had visited the Sutton farm that night. Chief Greenwell interviewed the neighbors. Though few lived within miles of the isolated farmhouse, those who were contacted reported hearing gunshots during the evening, but had assumed someone was hunting or shooting at predators threatening livestock. None had seen unusual lights or observed anything that might explain the creatures described by the Sutton family. The investigation continued until nearly dawn, with officers systematically examining every building and searching the surrounding woods for any additional evidence. They found nothing that would identify the intruders or explain their apparent immunity to gunfire. The creatures had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving behind only the physical traces of their visit. As the sun began to rise over the Kentucky countryside, the police concluded their initial investigation. The evidence supported the family's claim that something unusual had occurred, but it provided no clear explanation for what they had encountered. The case would be filed as an unexplained incident, with the physical evidence preserved and witness statements documented for future reference. Detective Batts collected samples of the unusual footprints by making plaster casts, and photographers documented the damage to the house and the scratches on the roof. The investigation was thorough and professional, conducted with the same attention to detail that would be applied to any serious crime. The officers took the family's account seriously, even if they could not explain what had actually happened. By sunrise, word of the incident had begun to spread beyond Hopkinsville. Radio reports and telephone calls carried news of the strange encounter to neighboring towns, and eventually to newspaper offices and radio stations across Kentucky. The Kelly incident was about to become a statewide and then a national story, attracting attention from investigators, reporters, and curiosity seekers from across the country. But first, the Sutton family would have to decide whether to return to their farmhouse or seek temporary shelter elsewhere. The creatures had not been found or captured, and there was no guarantee they would not return for another visit. The decision would not be easy, particularly for the children who had been traumatized by the night's events. Part 6: Dawn and Return. As the sun climbed higher over the Kentucky hills, the Sutton family faced a difficult decision. The police investigation had confirmed that something extraordinary had occurred at their farmhouse, but it had not eliminated the possibility that the creatures might return. The question of whether it was safe to go back home hung heavy over the exhausted family members. The children, particularly the younger ones, were reluctant to leave the safety of the police station. 7-year-old Charlton Langford had not spoken since arriving in Hopkinsville, and the other children stayed close to the adults, flinching at unexpected sounds and watching the windows with obvious anxiety. The night's events had left them deeply shaken, and the thought of returning to the scene of their terror was overwhelming. Glennie Langford, the family matriarch, was torn between her desire to protect her children and the practical necessity of returning home. The farmhouse contained all of their possessions, and they had nowhere else to go. Hotels were expensive, and relatives lived too far away to provide immediate shelter for such a large group. Despite her fears, she knew they would eventually have to face whatever remained at the farm. Lucky Sutton was more pragmatic about the situation. He had spent his life dealing with the challenges of rural living, from severe weather to dangerous animals, and he was not easily intimidated. The creatures had not harmed anyone during their long siege of the house, and the daylight seemed to offer natural protection against whatever had visited them in the darkness. Billy Ray Taylor, however, remained deeply disturbed by the encounter. As the first to see the strange light in the woods, and one of the two men who had directly confronted the creatures, he carried a heavier psychological burden than the others. He spoke little during the early morning hours, staring out the windows of the police station as if expecting to see glowing figures approaching across the parking lot. Chief Greenwell advised the family to wait until full daylight before returning to the farm. If the creatures were still in the area, they would be easier to spot and avoid during the day. He also promised that police patrols would check the property regularly over the following days, providing additional security and peace of mind for the frightened family. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, the family finally agreed to return home. The police provided an escort, with Chief Greenwell personally accompanying them to ensure their safety. The convoy of cars made the 8-mile journey through the peaceful countryside, passing tobacco fields and farmhouses where normal rural life was beginning another day. The Sutton farm looked different in the bright morning sunlight. The modest house sat quietly among the tobacco rows, with no sign of the terror that had gripped it just hours earlier. The yard was empty, the woods were still, and the only movement came from chickens pecking in the dirt near the back porch. It was difficult to believe that such an ordinary place had been the scene of such extraordinary events. The family approached the house cautiously, with Lucky and Taylor leading the way, while the police officers maintained a protective perimeter. The front door stood open as they had left it during their hasty escape, and the interior showed all the signs of the previous night's siege. Spent shells littered the floor, furniture remained pushed away from windows, and broken glass sparkled in the morning light. But there was no sign of the creatures. The house was empty, the yard was quiet, and the surrounding woods showed no evidence of unusual activity. Whatever had visited the Sutton farm during the night had departed with the darkness, leaving behind only memories and physical traces of their presence. The family began the process of cleaning up and returning to normal life. Glass was swept up, furniture was moved back into place, and the children were gradually coaxed out of their fearful silence. The routine activities of daily life helped restore a sense of normalcy, though everyone remained alert for any sign that the creatures might return. As the day progressed, visitors began arriving at the farm. Word of the incident had spread through the local community, and neighbors, friends, and curious strangers came to hear first-hand accounts of the encounter. The Sutton family found themselves reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, forced to repeat their story again and again for audiences that ranged from sympathetic to skeptical. Among the early visitors were reporters from the Kentucky New Era, the local Hopkinsville newspaper. They interviewed family members, photographed the damaged house, and documented the physical evidence that remained from the encounter. Their initial article, published later that day, would be the first media coverage of what would become known as the Kelly-Hopkinsville incident. The newspaper account was relatively restrained, focusing on the family's claims and the police investigation, without taking a position on whether the creatures were real or imagined. But even this cautious reporting was enough to attract attention from larger newspapers and radio stations across Kentucky and neighboring states. By evening, reporters from Louisville, Nashville, and other major cities were making plans to visit the remote Christian County farm. The family's ordeal was far from over. What had begun as a private terror was becoming a public spectacle, with implications that would extend far beyond the boundaries of rural Kentucky. The Kelly incident was about to become one of the most famous UFO-related encounters in American history, studied and debated by investigators for decades to come. But for the Sutton family, the immediate concern was simpler and more practical. They needed to repair their house, comfort their children, and somehow return to normal life after an experience that had shattered their sense of safety and security. The creatures might be gone, but the memory of their visit would linger much longer. As the sun set on August 22, 1955, the family gathered for their evening meal with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The house was secure, the police were watching, and the creatures had not returned during the daylight hours. But everyone knew that another night was approaching, and with it the possibility that their strange visitors might come back. The siege was over, but the mystery was just beginning. Part 7. The media descends. Within 48 hours of the police report, the Kelly incident had attracted attention from across the region and beyond. The initial newspaper account in the Kentucky New Era sparked interest from larger publications, radio stations, and eventually national media outlets. What had begun as a local police matter was rapidly becoming a phenomenon that would define how America thought about UFO encounters. The transformation was swift and overwhelming for the Sutton family. Reporters arrived at the remote farmhouse in growing numbers, setting up cameras and recording equipment in the front yard. Radio stations broadcast live reports from the scene, and newspaper photographers documented every detail of the property where the encounter had taken place. The family found themselves unprepared for the media attention. Lucky Sutton, a simple man who worked at a local sawmill, was suddenly fielding questions from reporters representing major newspapers and national radio networks. His wife Vera and the other family members were equally uncomfortable with the spotlight, preferring the privacy of rural life to the scrutiny of public attention. The children suffered most from the invasion of their privacy. Young Charlton Langford, already traumatized by the encounter with the creatures, became even more withdrawn as strangers with cameras and microphones surrounded his home. The other children struggled to understand why their terrifying experience had become a source of entertainment for visitors who treated the incident as a curiosity rather than a genuine trauma. Among the early media visitors was Andrew Ledgerwood, a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal. His article, published on August 24th, provided one of the most detailed and sympathetic accounts of the family's experience. Ledgerwood interviewed each family member separately and found their stories remarkably consistent, with no significant contradictions or embellishments. What impressed Ledgerwood most was the family's obvious reluctance to discuss the incident. Unlike people seeking publicity or financial gain, the Suttons appeared genuinely disturbed by their experience and uncomfortable with the attention it was generating. They answered questions honestly, but showed no desire to elaborate or dramatize their account for the benefit of reporters. Radio stations across Kentucky and neighboring states picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with family members and police officers involved in the investigation. The coverage was generally respectful, though some commentators expressed skepticism about the more unusual aspects of the encounter. The idea of creatures immune to gunfire and capable of climbing walls challenged conventional understanding of what was possible. National media attention followed quickly. Within a week, the Kelly incident was being reported by newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Radio networks carried the story coast to coast, and early television news programs included brief segments about the Kentucky family that claimed to have battled visitors from another world. The coverage was not uniformly positive. Some reporters approached the story with obvious skepticism, suggesting that the family had fabricated the encounter for publicity or had been frightened by ordinary animals that they had misidentified in the darkness. These accounts often emphasized the family's rural background and limited education, implying that they were unsophisticated people prone to superstition and imagination. More sympathetic coverage focused on the physical evidence and the consistency of the witness testimony. The damage to the house, the unusual footprints, and the spent ammunition all supported the family's claim that something extraordinary had occurred. Even skeptical reporters had difficulty explaining away the concrete evidence that remained at the scene. The attention brought both benefits and problems for the Sutton family. Curiosity seekers began arriving at the farm in large numbers, hoping to see the site of the famous encounter or perhaps witness a return visit by the creatures. Cars lined the narrow country road, and strangers walked through the yard at all hours, treating the family's property as a tourist attraction. The constant stream of visitors became a serious burden. The family could not maintain their normal routine, with reporters and tourists constantly interrupting their daily activities. Farm work was disrupted. Children could not play outside without being photographed or questioned, and the simple privacy that rural families took for granted was completely eliminated. Some visitors were more problematic than others. Thrill seekers arrived at night, hoping to encounter the creatures themselves, and some brought weapons in case they needed to defend themselves. The presence of armed strangers on the property created new safety concerns and added to the family's stress and anxiety. Religious groups also showed interest in the case, with some interpreting the encounter as evidence of demonic activity or divine intervention. Preachers arrived to offer spiritual guidance, and prayer groups held services on the property. While these visitors were generally well-meaning, their presence added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The family began to regret their decision to report the incident to police. What had seemed like the responsible course of action at the time had led to consequences they had never anticipated. Their private terror had become public entertainment, and their home had been transformed from a place of refuge into a spectacle for strangers. Lucky Sutton, in particular, struggled with the attention. As the head of the household, he felt responsible for protecting his family from both the original threat and the media circus that had followed. He began refusing interviews and asking reporters to leave the property, but his efforts to restore privacy were largely unsuccessful. The economic impact was mixed. While some family members received small payments for interviews and photographs, the disruption to their normal work routine more than offset any financial benefits. Lucky lost days of work at the sawmill, and the family's agricultural activities were severely hampered by the constant presence of visitors. Local businesses in Hopkinsville initially benefited from the influx of reporters and tourists, with restaurants and hotels seeing increased activity. But community opinion was divided about the attention the incident was bringing to the area. Some residents were proud that their small town had become famous, while others worried that the notoriety would create a lasting reputation for strangeness that would be difficult to overcome. Law enforcement continued to take the case seriously, despite the media attention. Chief Russell Greenwell maintained that his officers had found credible evidence of an unusual incident, and he defended the family against suggestions that they had fabricated their account. The police department's professional handling of the investigation lent credibility to the family's claims. As the media attention intensified, the family faced a decision about how to handle the ongoing scrutiny. They could continue cooperating with reporters and investigators, potentially benefiting financially from their experience but sacrificing their privacy and normal way of life, or they could withdraw from public attention, refusing interviews and attempting to return to anonymity. The choice would shape not only their own future, but also the legacy of the Kelly incident in UFO history. How they handled the media attention would influence whether their encounter was remembered as a credible case worthy of serious investigation or dismissed as a rural family's grab for fame and fortune. Part 8. The investigators arrive. As media attention intensified, a different kind of visitor began arriving at the Sutton farm. These were not reporters seeking sensational stories or tourists hoping for excitement, but serious investigators attempting to determine what had actually occurred on the night of August 21st. Their arrival marked a new phase in the Kelly incident, one that would establish it as a landmark case in UFO research. Among the first serious investigators was Isabel Davis, a researcher associated with Civilian Saucer Intelligence, one of the earliest civilian UFO investigation groups. Davis traveled to Kentucky within days of the initial reports, bringing with her a scientific approach to analyzing the evidence and interviewing witnesses. Unlike reporters focused on getting a story, she was interested in establishing facts and determining the credibility of the encounter. Davis spent several days at the farm, conducting detailed interviews with each family member and examining the physical evidence that remained from the incident. She was impressed by the consistency of the witness testimony and the reluctance of the family members to embellish their account or add dramatic details that might enhance their story. What struck Davis most was the obvious sincerity of the witnesses. The Sutton family showed none of the characteristics she associated with hoaxers or publicity seekers. They were uncomfortable with attention, reluctant to discuss details of their experience, and clearly traumatized by what they had endured. Their behavior suggested genuine fear rather than fabrication. The physical evidence also supported the family's account. Davis documented the damage to the house, photographed the unusual scratches on the roof and siding, and made detailed notes about the spent ammunition found throughout the building. She also examined the plaster casts of footprints that police had made, noting their unusual shape and size. Davis's investigation was particularly important because it was conducted so soon after the incident, before the evidence could be contaminated or the witnesses influenced by media coverage. Her report, published later in UFO research journals, provided a thorough and objective analysis of the case that became a standard reference for future investigators. Another early investigator was Major Donald Kehoe, a former Marine pilot who had become one of America's most prominent UFO researchers. Kehoe's organization, the The National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena was known for its serious approach to UFO cases and its connections within the military and aviation communities. Kehoe did not personally visit Kentucky, but he assigned experienced investigators to examine the Kelly case in detail. His team's report concluded that the Sutton family had experienced a genuine encounter with unknown entities, possibly extraterrestrial in origin. The report emphasized the credibility of the witnesses and the physical evidence supporting their account. The involvement of established UFO research organizations lent credibility to the Kelly incident and distinguished it from the many hoax claims and misidentifications that characterized much of the UFO phenomenon. These investigators had experience evaluating cases and could recognize the difference between genuine encounters and fabricated stories. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer who served as a consultant to the Air Force's Project Blue Book UFO investigation program, also took interest in the Kelly case. While Hynek did not conduct a formal investigation, he reviewed the available evidence and witness testimony. His initial assessment was cautious but acknowledged that the case presented features that were difficult to explain conventionally. Hynek was particularly intrigued by the consistency of the witness testimony and the apparent immunity of the creatures to gunfire. These details suggested either a very sophisticated hoax or a genuine encounter with entities possessing technology beyond human understanding. The case would influence his evolving views on UFO phenomena and contribute to his later shift from skepticism to serious investigation. Local investigators also became involved in studying the incident. Dr. William Becker, a psychologist from nearby Western Kentucky University, interviewed the family members to assess their mental state and the reliability of their testimony. His evaluation found no evidence of mental illness, substance abuse, or other factors that might explain the encounter as a hallucination or delusion. The investigators faced several challenges in studying the Kelly case. The remote location of the farm made detailed examination difficult, and the constant presence of media and tourists contaminated the scene and made it hard to preserve evidence. The family's growing reluctance to discuss their experience also limited access to first-hand testimony. Despite these obstacles, the investigators who studied the case in its immediate aftermath generally concluded that something extraordinary had occurred. While they could not definitively identify what the Sutton family had encountered, they found the evidence compelling enough to warrant serious consideration, rather than dismissal as a hoax or misidentification. The investigative reports produced during this period established the Kelly incident as one of the most credible UFO-related encounters on record. The combination of multiple witnesses, physical evidence, police investigation, and immediate follow-up by experienced researchers created a foundation of documentation that would sustain interest in the case for decades. However, the investigators also noted aspects of the case that remained problematic. The creature's apparent immunity to gunfire challenged conventional understanding of biology and physics. The lack of clear photographs or physical remains made definitive proof impossible, and the isolated location and darkness of the encounter limited the possibility of independent verification. These limitations did not invalidate the case in the eyes of most serious investigators, but they did prevent it from providing the kind of conclusive evidence that would settle the question of extraterrestrial visitation once and for all. The Kelly incident remained what most UFO cases were: compelling testimony supported by circumstantial evidence, but lacking the definitive proof that skeptics demanded. The involvement of serious investigators marked a turning point in how the Kelly incident was perceived. What had begun as a local news story had evolved into a case study that would influence UFO research for generations. The thorough documentation and analysis provided by these early investigators ensured that the case would be remembered and studied long after the media attention had faded. For the Sutton family, the arrival of investigators represented both validation and additional burden. While they appreciated having their account taken seriously by qualified researchers, the continued scrutiny prolonged their ordeal and made it more difficult to return to normal life. The investigation process, however necessary for establishing the facts, added another layer of disruption to their already chaotic existence. Part 9. Skeptics and Debunkers. As the Kelly incident gained national attention, it inevitably attracted the scrutiny of skeptics and debunkers who sought to provide conventional explanations for what the Sutton family claimed to have experienced. These critics played an important role in the case's development, forcing investigators to address weaknesses in the testimony and evidence while providing alternative theories for the encounter. One of the most prominent skeptical voices was Dr. Donald Menzel, a Harvard astronomer who had made a career of debunking UFO reports. Menzel approached the Kelly case with the assumption that it could be explained by conventional means, and he focused his analysis on finding flaws in the witness testimony and identifying natural phenomena that might account for the observations. Menzel's primary theory was that the family had been frightened by ordinary animals, most likely great horned owls, and had misidentified them in the darkness as something more exotic. He pointed out that owls could appear luminous under certain lighting conditions, particularly when their feathers caught and reflected artificial light. Their large eyes, nocturnal habits, and ability to move silently through trees could account for many of the creature's reported characteristics. The owl theory had some merit. Great horned owls were common in rural Kentucky. They were active at night, and they could indeed appear mysterious to observers unfamiliar with their behavior. Their distinctive calls might be interpreted as the chittering sounds the family reported hearing, and their ability to perch on roofs and near windows could explain the scratching sounds and glimpses of faces that had terrified the witnesses. However, the owl theory had significant weaknesses that its proponents struggled to address. Adult great horned owls typically stand about 2 feet tall, considerably smaller than the 3.5-foot creatures described by the family. Owls also could not account for the bipedal locomotion, the glowing skin, or the apparent immunity to gunfire that witnesses reported. Most problematically, the Sutton family included experienced hunters and rural residents who were familiar with local wildlife. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor had both hunted owls and other nocturnal animals, and they were unlikely to mistake common birds for unknown creatures, even under stressful conditions. Their detailed descriptions of the entities' appearance and behavior suggested familiarity with what they were observing rather than panicate misidentification. Another skeptical approach focused on the psychological aspects of the case. Some critics suggested that the family had experienced a form of mass hysteria, with one person's frightened reaction spreading to others until the entire group became convinced they were under attack by mysterious creatures. This theory attempted to explain why multiple witnesses reported similar observations without requiring the existence of actual entities. The mass hysteria theory was supported by documented cases of group delusions and shared hallucinations, particularly in isolated communities under stress. The Sutton family's rural background and limited education were cited as factors that might make them more susceptible to such psychological phenomena. The presence of children in the group was also noted, as young people were often more prone to suggestion and panic. However, psychological explanations also faced significant challenges. The physical evidence at the scene, including the damaged screens, scratched siding, and unusual footprints, could not be explained by hallucinations or hysteria. The family's behavior during and after the encounter was more consistent with genuine fear than with psychological delusion, and the duration of the incident, lasting several hours, was unusually long for most forms of mass hysteria. Some skeptics proposed that the entire incident had been fabricated by the family for financial gain or attention. This theory suggested that the Suttons had deliberately created false evidence and coordinated their testimony to fool investigators and media. The hoax theory was appealing to critics because it explained all aspects of the case without requiring acceptance of extraordinary claims. The hoax theory was undermined by several factors. The family showed no signs of having prepared for media attention and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the publicity they received. Their accounts remained consistent under repeated questioning by different investigators, suggesting either genuine experience or an impossibly sophisticated level of coordination. Most importantly, the family gained little financial benefit from their story and suffered significant disruption to their normal lives. Physical evidence also complicated hoax theories, creating false footprints with the unusual characteristics found at the scene would have required considerable planning and skill. The damage to the house was extensive and consistent with the family's account of a prolonged siege, and the large quantity of spent ammunition found throughout the building suggested that the shooting had been genuine rather than staged. Another line of skeptical inquiry focused on the timing and circumstances of the sighting. Critics noted that UFO reports had been increasing throughout the 1950s, creating a cultural context in which people might be more likely to interpret unusual experiences in extraterrestrial terms. The Kelly incident occurred during a period of heightened public interest in flying saucers and space visitors. This cultural explanation suggested that the family had been influenced by contemporary UFO stories and had unconsciously shaped their account to fit popular expectations about alien encounters. The creature's appearance, with large eyes and small stature, was consistent with emerging descriptions of extraterrestrial beings in science fiction and UFO literature. However, the cultural influence theory was weakened by the family's apparent unfamiliarity with UFO phenomena. None of the witnesses showed particular interest in or knowledge of flying saucer stories, and their description of the encounter focused on immediate, concrete details rather than abstract concepts about space visitors. The creatures they described also differed in significant ways from the typical little green men portrayed in popular culture of the time. Military explanations were also proposed by some skeptics. The creatures might have been military personnel conducting secret experiments or training exercises, possibly testing new equipment or psychological warfare techniques. The apparent immunity to gunfire could be explained by advanced body armor, and the glowing appearance might result from experimental suits or equipment. The military theory had some plausibility given the Cold War context and the extensive secret research being conducted by defense agencies during the 1950s. However, no evidence ever emerged of military operations in the Kelly area on August 21st. The creature's small stature and unusual proportions were inconsistent with human personnel, even if wearing special equipment, and military personnel would be unlikely to maintain such an operation for hours while under sustained gunfire. The debate between believers and skeptics that emerged from the Kelly incident established patterns that would characterize UFO controversies for decades to come. Believers emphasized the credibility of witnesses, the consistency of testimony, and the physical evidence supporting extraordinary claims. Skeptics focused on alternative explanations, psychological factors, and the lack of definitive proof. Both sides made valid points that contributed to a more complete understanding of the case. Skeptical analysis forced investigators to address weaknesses in the evidence and consider conventional explanations more carefully. At the same time, the inability of skeptics to provide fully satisfactory alternative theories highlighted the genuinely puzzling aspects of the encounter. The Kelly incident demonstrated that even the most thorough skeptical analysis could not definitively resolve cases with strong witness testimony and supporting evidence. While conventional explanations could account for some aspects of the encounter, none could address all the reported phenomena without requiring assumptions that were almost as extraordinary as the original claims. Part 10. The Return of the Creatures. The media attention and investigative scrutiny that followed the initial Kelly incident created an expectation that the creatures might return to the Sutton farm. This possibility both terrified and intrigued those following the case. For the family, the prospect of another encounter was a source of ongoing anxiety. For researchers and curiosity seekers, it represented an opportunity to gather additional evidence or witness the phenomena firsthand. The family's fear of a return visit was well-founded. Throughout the remainder of August and into September 1955, they reported several instances of unusual activity around their property. These subsequent encounters were less dramatic than the original siege, but suggested that their connection to the mysterious entities had not ended with that first terrifying night. On several occasions, family members reported seeing lights moving through the woods near the house, particularly in the gully where Billy Ray Taylor had first observed the descending object. These lights were described as similar to the glow that had emanated from the creatures during the initial encounter, a soft, silvery radiance that seemed to move with purpose through the darkness. The lights were usually observed from inside the house, with family members reluctant to venture outside for closer examination. When they did attempt to investigate, the lights would fade or disappear before they could get close enough for detailed observation. This pattern suggested that whatever was producing the illumination was aware of human presence and deliberately avoiding contact. More disturbing were the continued sounds around the property. Family members reported hearing the same chittering voices that had accompanied the original siege, though these were fainter and more distant than before. The sounds seemed to come from different locations on different nights, sometimes from the woods, sometimes from the fields, and occasionally from closer to the house itself. On at least 2 occasions, family members claimed to have seen the creatures themselves, though only briefly and at a distance. These sightings occurred in the early evening hours, just after sunset, when visibility was poor but not completely absent. The figures were described as moving quickly across the open areas between the woods and the tobacco fields, always retreating when observed. The most significant follow-up encounter occurred on September 15th, nearly a month after the original incident. Lucky, Sutton, and Billy Ray Taylor were working in the barn when they heard scratching sounds coming from the roof of the house. The sounds were identical to those they had heard during the siege, and both men immediately recognized them as evidence that the creatures had returned. This time, however, the family was better prepared. Lucky had purchased additional ammunition and had positioned weapons throughout the house for quick access. The children had been instructed on what to do if the creatures returned, and emergency plans had been made for contacting police and evacuating the property if necessary. The September encounter was much briefer than the original siege. The scratching sounds continued for about 20 minutes, accompanied by occasional glimpses of movement on the roof and around the yard. Lucky fired several warning shots from inside the house, and the activity ceased immediately. Unlike the August incident, the creatures did not persist in their approach or attempt to maintain their presence around the property. This pattern of brief, intermittent activity continued through the fall of 1955. The encounters became less frequent and less intense over time, suggesting that whatever had drawn the entities to the Sutton farm was gradually diminishing. By winter, the unusual activity had largely ceased, though family members remained vigilant for signs of the creature's return. The follow-up encounters were significant for several reasons. They demonstrated that the original incident was not an isolated event, but part of an ongoing phenomenon. The consistency of the subsequent reports with the initial encounter supported the credibility of the family's account and made hoax theories more difficult to sustain. However, the later encounters were also more ambiguous than the original siege. The creatures were seen only briefly and at a distance, making detailed observation impossible. The activity was less dramatic and could potentially be explained by conventional causes such as animals or natural phenomena. This ambiguity made the follow-up reports less compelling to investigators and easier for skeptics to dismiss. The timing of the subsequent encounters also raised questions about their relationship to the media attention surrounding the case. Critics suggested that the family might have been unconsciously influenced by their newfound fame to interpret ordinary events as evidence of the creature's return. The expectation that something unusual might happen could create a psychological environment where normal sounds and sights were given extraordinary significance. Nevertheless, the pattern of follow-up activity was consistent with other cases in UFO literature, where initial encounters were followed by periods of intermittent, less dramatic contact. This pattern suggested that the Kelly incident might be part of a larger phenomenon, rather than an isolated event, lending support to theories about ongoing extraterrestrial monitoring or contact. The family's handling of the subsequent encounters also demonstrated their genuine desire to avoid publicity rather than seek it. They reported the follow-up activity reluctantly and only to close friends and investigators who had earned their trust. They made no effort to generate additional media attention and, if anything, tried to downplay the significance of the later events. As the frequency of unusual activity declined, the Sutton family gradually began to return to a more normal existence. The constant presence of reporters and tourists also diminished as public interest in the case waned. By the spring of 1956, the farm had largely returned to its pre-incident quiet, though the family remained forever changed by their experience. The question of whether the creatures had actually returned or whether the follow-up reports represented misinterpretation of ordinary events remained unresolved. Like the original encounter, the subsequent activity generated compelling testimony from credible witnesses, but lacked the definitive evidence that would satisfy all investigators. What was clear was that the Kelly incident had created a lasting impact on everyone involved. The family would never again feel completely secure in their rural home, always aware that the darkness might conceal visitors from another world, and investigators would continue to study the case for decades, seeking to understand what had really happened during those terrifying nights in Christian County, Kentucky. Part 11. Legacy and Investigation. In the years following the Kelly-Hopkinsville incident, the case established itself as one of the most significant and enduring encounters in UFO literature. Its combination of multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence, police investigation, and thorough documentation by researchers created a foundation that would influence how future cases were studied and evaluated. The incident became a touchstone for serious UFO investigators, representing the kind of case that demanded careful analysis rather than casual dismissal. The detailed witness testimony, consistent across multiple interviews conducted over many years, provided a template for how encounter reports should be documented and preserved. The immediate police response and physical evidence collection demonstrated the importance of official involvement in validating extraordinary claims. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who had initially approached the case with caution, eventually classified it as one of the most credible close encounter reports in his files. His evolving assessment of the Kelly incident reflected his broader shift from skepticism to serious investigation of UFO phenomena. The case played a role in convincing Hynek that some encounters could not be easily explained by conventional means. The incident also influenced the development of UFO classification systems. Hynek's famous close encounters categories were partly inspired by cases like Kelly, which involved direct interaction between witnesses and apparently non-human entities. The Kelly case became a classic example of a close encounter of the third kind, involving observation of occupants or entities associated with UFO phenomena. Academic researchers also took interest in the case, though often from perspectives that differed from those of UFO investigators. Sociologists studied the Kelly incident as an example of how communities respond to extraordinary claims and how media attention can transform private experiences into public phenomena. Psychologists examined the case for insights into group dynamics, perception under stress, and the reliability of eyewitness testimony. The case attracted attention from folklore specialists who noted similarities between the creatures described by the Sutton family and traditional supernatural entities from European and American folk traditions. Some researchers suggested that the Kelly encounter might represent a modern manifestation of ancient archetypal experiences, updated for the space age, but fundamentally similar to historical accounts of encounters with otherworldly beings. This folkloric interpretation did not necessarily invalidate the reality of the encounter, but provided a broader context for understanding its significance. Whether the creatures were extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, or manifestations of human consciousness, the Kelly incident connected to deep patterns of human experience with the unknown and unexplained. The case also became important in discussions about the nature of evidence and proof in anomalous phenomena. Skeptics pointed to Kelly as an example of how even compelling cases lacked the definitive physical evidence necessary to establish extraordinary claims beyond reasonable doubt. Believers countered that the case demonstrated how conventional standards of proof might be inadequate for evaluating genuinely unprecedented phenomena. This debate highlighted fundamental questions about epistemology and the nature of knowledge. How much evidence was sufficient to establish the reality of extraordinary events? What kinds of proof would be acceptable for claims that challenged existing scientific paradigms? The Kelly case provided a concrete example for exploring these abstract philosophical questions. Over the decades, new investigators continued to study the case, conducting follow-up interviews with surviving family members and re-examining the original evidence. These later investigations generally supported the conclusions of the early researchers, finding no evidence of hoax or deliberate deception and confirming the consistency of the witnesses' accounts over time. Technological advances also provided new tools for analyzing the Kelly case. Computer enhancement of photographs from the scene revealed additional details about the physical evidence. Statistical analysis of the witness testimony identified patterns and correlations that supported the credibility of the accounts. Geographic information systems mapped the encounter location and surrounding area to better understand the environmental context. However, these technological approaches also had limitations. The passage of time had degraded much of the physical evidence, and the original witnesses were aging, with some having died and others becoming less willing to discuss their experiences. The case remained frozen in time, with no new evidence emerging that could definitively resolve the questions it raised. The Kelly incident also became a cultural touchstone, referenced in books, movies, and television programs about UFO encounters. This popular culture treatment was a double-edged sword, increasing public awareness of the case while sometimes distorting or sensationalizing its details. The challenge for serious researchers was to separate the documented facts from the fictional embellishments that accumulated around the story over time. Educational institutions began including the Kelly case in courses on anomalous phenomena, critical thinking, and the history of American popular culture. The incident provided a valuable case study for examining how extraordinary claims are evaluated, how evidence is interpreted, and how social and cultural factors influence the acceptance or rejection of unusual reports. The case also had a lasting impact on the field of UFO research itself. It demonstrated the importance of immediate, thorough investigation of encounter reports and the value of preserving witness testimony and physical evidence for future analysis. The Kelly incident became a model for how UFO cases should be studied, establishing standards that influenced investigators for generations. International researchers also took interest in the case, comparing it to similar encounters reported in other countries and cultures. These comparative studies revealed patterns and similarities that suggested either a global phenomenon or universal human tendencies in interpreting unusual experiences. The Kelly incident became part of a broader database of anomalous encounters that transcended national and cultural boundaries. As the 50th anniversary of the encounter approached, renewed interest in the case brought new investigators and new perspectives to its analysis. Modern researchers brought fresh eyes to old evidence and new theories to explain the phenomena reported by the Sutton family. Yet, despite decades of study, the fundamental questions raised by the Kelly incident remained unresolved. The case had achieved a kind of immortality in the literature of anomalous phenomena, neither definitively proven nor conclusively debunked. It stood as a reminder that human experience occasionally produces events that challenge our understanding of reality and resist easy explanation. Whether the creatures were real or imagined, the Kelly-Hopkinsville incident had earned its place as one of the most significant and enduring mysteries in American history. Part 12. The Enduring Mystery. More than 6 decades after that terrifying night in August 1955, the Kelly-Hopkinsville incident remains as puzzling and controversial as ever. The passage of time has not diminished its significance in UFO literature, nor has it provided the definitive answers that might finally resolve the questions raised by the Sutton family's extraordinary claims. The surviving witnesses, now elderly, have maintained their accounts with remarkable consistency throughout the decades. Those family members still alive continue to insist that their encounter was genuine, despite the skepticism and ridicule they have often faced. Their unwavering testimony, spanning more than 60 years, represents one of the most persistent and consistent witness accounts in the history of anomalous phenomena. Calvin Parker, the youngest adult witness to the original encounter, has spoken publicly about the case in recent years, reaffirming his account of the creatures and their apparent immunity to gunfire. His descriptions remain vivid and detailed, unchanged from his original testimony given to police on that August night in 1955. The clarity of his memories and his continued willingness to discuss the encounter publicly have impressed many investigators. The physical location of the encounter has become a pilgrimage site of sorts for UFO researchers and enthusiasts. The original Sutton farmhouse no longer exists, having been demolished decades ago, but the rural Kentucky landscape remains largely unchanged. Visitors to the area report an eerie quality to the countryside, though whether this reflects genuine anomalous activity or simply the power of suggestion remains unclear. Local residents in Christian County have mixed feelings about their area's place in UFO history. Some embrace the notoriety and the occasional tourism it brings, while others prefer to downplay the incident and focus on more conventional aspects of their community's heritage. The Kelly encounter has become part of the local folklore, passed down through generations of families who remember when their quiet corner of Kentucky briefly became the center of national attention. Modern technology has provided new tools for analyzing historical cases like Kelly, but it has also highlighted the limitations of evidence gathered with 1950s techniques. Digital enhancement of photographs from the scene has revealed additional details, but it cannot create evidence that was never collected in the first place. Computer modeling of the reported trajectories and movements has supported some aspects of the witnesses' accounts, while raising questions about others. Contemporary UFO researchers continue to study the Kelly case, often using it as a benchmark against which to measure other encounter reports. The thorough documentation, multiple witnesses, and physical evidence make it an ideal case study for exploring questions about the nature of evidence, the reliability of testimony, and the challenges of investigating anomalous phenomena. The case has also attracted attention from researchers exploring the psychological and sociological aspects of extraordinary experiences. Some studies have focused on how traumatic events are remembered and reported over time, using the Kelly witnesses as subjects for examining the stability of memory under stress. Others have looked at how communities respond to claims of anomalous experiences and how media attention affects both witnesses and their neighbors. Skeptical researchers have not abandoned their efforts to find conventional explanations for the Kelly encounter. New theories continue to emerge, often incorporating advances in understanding of animal behavior, atmospheric phenomena, or psychological processes. However, none of these explanations has gained universal acceptance, and many face the same fundamental problems that plagued earlier attempts to debunk the case. The debate over the Kelly incident reflects broader questions about the nature of reality and the limits of human knowledge. In an age of increasing scientific sophistication, the persistence of unexplained phenomena challenges assumptions about what is possible and what kinds of evidence are necessary to establish extraordinary claims. The Kelly case serves as a reminder that mystery and uncertainty remain part of the human experience. Some researchers have suggested that the Kelly encounter might be better understood as part of a broader category of anomalous experiences that includes not only UFO sightings but also reports of cryptozoological creatures, paranormal phenomena, and other unexplained events. This approach emphasizes the experiential reality of such encounters while remaining agnostic about their ultimate cause or nature. The influence of the Kelly case extends beyond UFO research into popular culture, academic study, and public consciousness. It has been referenced in countless books, articles, and documentaries about unexplained phenomena. It has inspired fictional works and provided material for television programs and movies. The incident has become part of American folklore, a modern legend that continues to capture imaginations and provoke debate. Educational institutions have used the Kelly case as a teaching tool for courses on critical thinking, research methodology, and the evaluation of evidence. Students are challenged to examine the testimony, consider alternative explanations, and draw their own conclusions about what might have occurred on that August night in rural Kentucky. The case provides a concrete example for exploring abstract concepts about knowledge, belief, and the nature of proof. The Kelly-Hopkinsville incident also serves as a historical marker, representing a particular moment in American culture when belief in extraterrestrial visitation was emerging as a significant social phenomenon. The case occurred during the early years of the modern UFO era, when public interest in flying saucers was growing, but before the subject had become heavily commercialized or culturally codified. As we look back on the Kelly encounter from the perspective of the 21st century, it appears both as a product of its time and as a timeless mystery that transcends its historical context. The specific details of the case reflect the rural American experience of the 1950s, but the fundamental questions it raises about the nature of reality and human experience remain as relevant today as they were decades ago. The enduring significance of the Kelly-Hopkinsville incident lies not necessarily in whether the Sutton family actually encountered visitors from another world, but in what their experience reveals about the mysteries that still surround us. In an age when we can communicate instantly across the globe and explore the surface of Mars, the idea that something unknown might visit a remote Kentucky farmhouse reminds us that the universe remains full of possibilities we have yet to understand. Whether the creatures that allegedly besieged the Sutton farmhouse were extraterrestrial beings, interdimensional visitors, unknown earthly entities, or products of human psychology, their story continues to challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what is real. The Kelly incident stands as a monument to mystery in an age that often claims to have answers for everything. As night falls over the Kentucky countryside where it all began, the questions raised by that August evening in 1955 remain as compelling as ever. What did the Sutton family encounter in the darkness? What does their experience tell us about the nature of reality and the limits of human understanding? And in our rush to explain away the unexplained, what mysteries might we be overlooking in our own time? The Kelly-Hopkinsville incident endures because it reminds us that the universe is larger and stranger than we often dare to imagine. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and scientific explanation, it preserves a space for wonder, mystery, and the acknowledgement that some questions may never find satisfactory answers. And perhaps that is the most valuable legacy of all. Thank you for joining us on this journey to a small Kentucky town where the summer of 1955 brought visitors no one expected. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter remains one of the most documented and enduring mysteries in American history. What do you think happened on that August night? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories from the edges of the known world intrigue you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our next exploration into the unexplained. Until then, rest well and remember that the darkness may hold more than we ever imagined.